YouTube? Once again, it's Kennard Vernon Stewart here for the podcast. We're talking Auburn football. Like the video, comment, and subscribe to Vernon Speaks Sports Auburn. I'm Kennard Stewart, your host. And as always, it's great to be an Auburn Tiger War Eagle for yet another CarCast. I know some of the fans back in the day did not like the CarCast, but we got to get it in as we can. So let's get right to it. Thinking about this particular Auburn football season, you have a lot of different elements involved, especially from a coaching standpoint. And I think, across the Power Five, it's going to be some challenges, period, because the coaches do not have the luxury of spring football. They don't have the luxury of the traditional summer camps. So it's going to be a bit challenging, but I think there's some coaches who are going to be a little bit more challenged than some. And when I think about the most important coach, assistant coach for the Auburn Tigers this year, a lot of things come to mind. Number one, you got to look at the tenure in which that coach has been there. You have to look at the time spent with his coaching staff in general and the players. And, you come up with a wide range of scenarios because Auburn is in a position to where there are a lot of changes. You talk about the players that have left. You talk about Noah Igbenogany, no longer there. Derek Brown, Marlon Davidson, no longer there. Jeremiah Denson, Daniel Thomas, no longer there. Javaris Davis, no longer there. These are all defensive players. And if you think about it, you would come to believe that, hey, maybe Kevin Steele is the most important coach of the 2020 football season. But Kevin Steele is not necessarily the most important coach because now we've garnished we have respect for him anyway, but now we have some solidified respect and trust in Kevin Steele that with the personnel given, he's going to figure it out because he's figured it out before with probably way less talent than he does now and performed on a pretty high level. So Kevin Steele is not necessarily that coach that I'm overly concerned about as to whether his troops are going to be ready to hit the field come August, early September. Now, what I do know is that Kevin Steele does still have some challenges, though, because losing a Marlon Davidson and a Derek Brown, those guys will never be replaced. That's a once or an occasional in a generation type talent. And they still developed to the level that they developed. It was a good thing those guys stayed for an additional year. I think that did them a huge service as far as their market value in the NFL and the recruitability now for Auburn at that particular position, because you have Marlon Davidson and Derek Brown on a week in and week out basis, basically competing with each other as to who's going to be the SEC defensive player of the week. So I think they really put their stamp from a brand standpoint that Auburn is probably a pretty good place for a defensive lineman to go. Good job for those two particular guys. And I just don't think that Kevin Steele, Travis Williams on the defensive side, none of the secondary, Charles Woodson, none of the secondary guys as coaches really have too much to worry about because they have a brand, they have a culture in place as to what the expectation is on the defensive side of the football field. Then we look over to the offense. We look at a situation where, yes, you do have the SEC Freshman of the Year, Bo Nix, returning at quarterback. A lot of question marks there. As a matter of fact, ESPN came up with some type of betting odds, so to speak, as to Auburn's potential as national champions. Now, the numerical amount after the plus sign is the better your odds. Like, say, for instance, LSU and Alabama, they're around that plus 250, plus 300 area. Auburn is more so around that plus 2,000, plus 3,000 area. That means they have a lower likelihood to win a national championship. And when given all the elements involved, rightfully so. One, you have a somewhat, there's a polarized level of whether Bo Nix has proven himself or not. He's won some big games, but at the same time, his level of play has been very inconsistent against high-level Power 5 competition. Without going into the math, he just didn't perform well against high-level Power 5 competition like LSU, Florida, teams of that nature. Alabama, he did okay, but still wasn't just absolutely lights out. So if Auburn is going to really be a national championship contender, Bo Nix has got to make some plays. And that's something that even ESPN mentioned, is that the Bo Nix that we see the potential of being a high-level quarterback has to come out. If that doesn't come out, then Auburn kind of sort of doesn't have a chance to be at that optimal level of play when you talk about possible national champion. Because if you think about the national championship appearances, the national championship wins for Auburn, it came from optimal play at the quarterback position via Nick Marshall and Cam Newton. They took their play, took their team to the next level, and those appearances happened. Auburn won the national championship, obviously, in 2010, made an appearance 3 seconds away from being national champions a few years later. So I think Bo Nix has to accentuate his game to where he's not being protected, to where he's not being the game manager, and he's going to have to make some plays. Those plays that break down when he has to scramble and when he has to make something out of nothing has to be more positive than just throwing the ball at his receiver's feet just so he won't be called with an intentional grounding penalty. Those plays have to be more productive, and I think more productive scrambling. You look at guys like Johnny Manziel, Cam Newton, Baker Mayfield, even Nick Marshall, guys like that, Joe Burrow. When they scramble, the opposing defense starts to get nervous because they know something good is about to happen. But when Bo Nix scrambles in 2019, is more of a him bailing himself out from a sack. Because you can kind of count those, even though the yardage wasn't lost, kind of sort of like a sack. So I think Bo Nix is going to have to accentuate his game to where he's more than a game manager, more than playing it safe, but actually really legitimately leading the team to higher levels of performance. Which brings me to my next point. I think the overall most important coach of the 2020 season is going to be Chad Morris. Chad Morris, the newly installed offensive coordinator for the Auburn Tigers, a friend of Gus Malzahn, somewhat documented as a protege of Gus Malzahn's particular offense, the hurry up, no huddle, the diverse offense that Gus Malzahn made so famous, especially with guys like Cam Newton back in the early portion of the 2010s. Chad Morris is in a very interesting position. Number one, he did not have the spring football training as an opportunity to really get to know the players. He did not have the luxury of helping Jack Bignell, who is also a new assistant coach for Auburn as an offensive line coach. They're going to have to piece this thing together at the last minute. And everyone knows that a lot of the dismantling of Auburn's offense last year started up front. Folks like to say, well, Gus Malzahn's play call. I really don't think Gus called bad plays. I think Gus did himself a bad disservice from a proactivity standpoint by just not being prepared from a personnel arena. He just wasn't prepared he didn't have the players to execute. Call good plays. A lot of times the plays were there, just weren't executed. But who does that fall back on? That falls back on the head coach. You have to put yourself in a position to be successful. Chad Morris got to piece together the offensive line. Also has to figure out who is going to be the other two pieces, or maybe the other 1.5 pieces to the wide receiver puzzle. Because you have Seth Williams, and I think Anthony Schwartz is a very, very good candidate, or very, very good reliable receiver as long as he can sustain himself from injury. He and Seth Williams actually had a pretty good thing going on until he got hurt again in the Alabama game. But who's going to be the other two receivers? You talk about guys like maybe Zach Farrar. You talk about Kobe Hudson from this recruiting class. Johnson from the 2019 recruiting class. So who's going to fill that 1.5, those other two spots at wide receiver is going to be important for Chad Morris. Again, I think you got a loaded backfield. I think you got a very talented backfield. Maybe one of the more talented in maybe the SEC West at least. But at the same time, the guys haven't really proven themselves. DJ Williams, I think, has great potential. Has not proven himself as an every down back. Can he do it? I think he can. But that's something that Chad Morris is going to have to figure out as to, as far as where he's at with the Auburn Tigers. So I think when we look at the totality of circumstance, the most important assistant coach, the one who's going to have the biggest challenge going into the 2020 season is Chad Morris. Let me know what you guys think. Leave your comments like you always do. I get a lot of inspiration from those comments. This one I actually came up with on my own, but I definitely appreciate all the comments because a lot of times those lead to actual videos. Go ahead and click the bell twice so that you can get all of the notifications for Vernon Speaks Sports Auburn. I am your host, Kennard Vernon Stewart, and as always, it's great to be an Auburn Tiger, War Eagle.